The crown, once the ultimate symbol of power throughout the world. But today, the very nature of royalty is under threat. In this landmark series, we use specialized archive colorization techniques to bring to life over 100 years of royalty. And discover why over half the world's royal families have lost their thrones, while others have kept their crowns on their heads. In this episode, Britain's King George V must keep his country safe from the dangers of fascism and Nazi Germany.
George V realized that either you were going to give in to them or you were going to take them on.
But his eldest son's affair with married woman Wallis Simpson is throwing the crown into crisis.
There was a huge worry at the time it would ruin the monarchy.
And when the prince befriends Hitler, the British government and royal family have to take drastic action before it's too late.
And so Edward's situation and deep Nazi beliefs become a very real problem for the British royal family.
It's the 1920s. World War I is over. It's time to celebrate.
After the First World War, people were just happy to be alive.
We're through the worst of it. We fought a war to end all wars, and now we can look to the future.
Europe's major capital cities like Paris and London catch fire with creativity. And a new music scene emerges from America, jazz. The young live fast and party hard. The decade soon becomes known as the Roaring Twenties.
Why were they roaring? They were roaring because people wanted to let rip.
But there's another side to this post-war era. The faces and bodies of the men who sacrificed themselves for this peace.
So during the 20s, there was this sort of ghostly element to it. The men who'd survived in the trenches, not all of them came back whole.
The war's survivors are shell-shocked, and many are angry at the royal rulers who led them into a world war. Anti-monarchy feelings are sweeping across the continent. The royal families of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia have already lost their thrones. And in Britain, the monarchy is under threat from the spread of communist ideas. King George V has clung on to his power. But with growing discontent at home after the horrors of World War I, could he be next?
There's no doubt that George V was affected by this revolutionary turmoil at the end of the First World War. He's seen two of his cousins, Nicholas and Wilhelm, topple from their thrones.
He knew that if he was going to retain his throne, he was going to have to do something to connect with his people.
While George looks for a way to keep the British public on his side, he witnesses one of his royal allies in Europe take a huge political gamble to stay on the throne. King Victor Emmanuel is the ruler of Italy. Like King George in Britain, Victor's Italy is also on the winning side in World War I. But victory has brought Italy nothing but pain.
Italy is a total mess after World War I, and like for many participants in World War I, there is a lot of frustration that the war did not give Italy what it wanted.
People have had to make enormous sacrifices to survive, and the financial cost of the war is now causing a political crisis. Italian democracy is very different from Britain's at this time. The Italian king is not just a figurehead. He has all the power and is the only person who can appoint the prime minister.
Italy in the 1920s has a form of parliamentary democracy, but the ultimate authority in the country is still the king. He decides whether the country goes to war, and crucially, he appoints the prime minister.
The King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele, is struggling to keep the country together. There is a quick succession of governments and parliamentary votes of no confidence, and in fact, no political faction can gain enough track and enough support to hold the country together for a while. Italy is slowly descending into political chaos.
The people of Italy are desperate for a political alternative. But if communism takes hold in Italy, this will put the king in a dangerous position.
Victor Emmanuel's power in Italy after World War I is fragile because of the revolutionary spread, particularly the spread of communism after the Russian Revolution. There is no place for monarchs in that system.
The Italian king observes a new right-wing figure emerge from the political chaos, a man who does believe in hierarchy and social order. His name is Benito Mussolini, and he thinks he can make Italy great again.
Mussolini wanted to revive the Roman Empire and create a massive, shall we say, Italian space in the Mediterranean for the Italian race to thrive.
Mussolini's vision for Italy follows a new ideology called fascism.
Fascism is an ultranationalist, authoritarian, racist political movement that believed in state control of the economy, the regimentation of society, and what fascism did not accept is that everyone was equal.
When Victor Emmanuel hears about fascism, he's intrigued. Could Mussolini defend Italy from communism and help him stay on the throne? Mussolini's right-wing party rapidly grows in popularity, and at a fascist rally in October 1922, Mussolini gives his followers a command to march on the capital of Italy and the seat of the king's power, Rome. When the fascists arrive in the city, things turn violent. They demand that their leader becomes the new prime minister.
By unleashing this, effectively a coup d'etat against the existing government in Italy, there is a tremendous threat of bloodshed.
Now Victor Emmanuel must make a choice. Will he allow the fascists to continue the march, or will he use his military to crush them?
The then Prime Minister, who's a liberal Prime Minister, says to the king, look, these guys are marching on Rome, but don't worry, the military have assured me we can deal with them, no problem. You just need to give me the order.
But Victor Emmanuel never gives the command. Instead, the king decides to make Mussolini his new Prime Minister. Victor Emmanuel's decision to align himself with fascism is motivated by a royal instinct to survive.
Vittorio Emanuele may have thought that Mussolini was his best chance at bringing some order to Italy.
I think he's beginning to associate in his own mind with fascism being the way forward.
At first, it seems the plan works.
Mussolini creates effective infrastructure, jobs, and gets the economy moving enough to alleviate many of the problems caused by the economic crisis.
The King of Italy keeps his crown. But over time, Mussolini shows his true colors. His leadership transforms into a dictatorship, and Mussolini changes his title from Prime Minister to Il Duce, the leader. While Victor Emmanuel keeps his crown for now, it's clear to every Italian who really wields power. The fate of the King of Italy is a dire warning for Britain's George V. Royal flirtations with fascism can backfire. George needs another way to hold on to power.
They hatch this plan. The king and his family have to find a way of really connecting with the British people, and particularly, interestingly, the British working classes.
Although today, of course, we take it for granted that the royal family will smile and shake hands and visit hospitals and chat to people. That was not the case with the Victorian monarchy, and it was very much King George V that moved it into the modern era.
During the 1920s, George V goes further than just meeting with his people. He appoints Ramsay MacDonald, Britain's first Prime Minister from the Labour Party, the party for the working people.
In many ways, George V creates the idea of the British monarchy as everyone's monarchy, not just the elite's monarchy.
Then, in 1932, perhaps the most significant change George V makes is when he speaks to his subjects personally, through the magic of radio, in what becomes known as the King's Christmas Speech.
I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all. To all, to each, I wish a happy Christmas. God bless you.
Although he had this very ponderous, sort of slow, rather melancholy delivery, people absolutely loved it.
You have the voice of the empire coming through to you, directly to you.
You know, it's a sort of magic thing, isn't it? And it's instantly over the airwaves. This fantastically important person is talking straight into your living room.
But behind the scenes is a dark secret. The king is terminally ill. Diagnosed with chronic bronchitis, he is only expected to live a few more years. George must ensure whoever inherits the throne continues to win the love and respect of the British people. The future of the monarchy depends upon it. King George V's two eldest sons are Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, and Prince Bertie, who, as the second oldest son, is the so-called spare to the throne.
As king, you've got to have an heir to inherit everything and a spare in case that person dies before you do.
The two brothers are total opposites, and Edward seems to get all the fun. Edward is the first in line to the crown and will be the next King of England, and that makes him very desirable.
As a young man, Prince Edward was probably the most eligible bachelor in the world. He was somebody who was very good looking, he was very charming, he was magnetic to women.
Outwardly dapper, fashionable, very modern, he's obsessed with America, he loves jazz. And he very quickly gets a reputation as a sort of handsome man about town.
To prepare Edward for his future role of king, his father sends the prince on foreign tours of the British Empire to represent the crown. And Prince Edward is adored.
If you look at the public perception, of course, he was greeted as hugely popular because he was charming, he had a wonderful smile, he had film star good looks.
Prince Edward had this charisma to him. He was somebody who people could actually warm to.
But behind the good looks and charm, Edward is also haunted by the legacy of World War I. He served in the British Army and saw the war's horrors firsthand. But, unlike other men of his generation, the prince didn't fight on the front line.
I think there might have been a bit of survivor's guilt. There was a feeling that although he was allowed to join up, he hadn't been allowed to do the job.
During the 20s and 30s, the handsome prince gains a reputation as a ladies' man.
It became very clear that actually Edward loved the company of the various women that he was meeting on his tours.
Although King George wants his son to connect with the people, this is not what he had in mind.
George would like him to marry possibly a princess, but actually a nice, suitable, aristocratic English rose.
He gets this sort of horrible feeling, oh no, here's this sort of loose cannon in the royal family at a time where I cannot afford a loose cannon if we're to keep the monarchy together.
And Edward seems to have a particular choice in the women he wants. Married women.
Prince Edward having relationships with married women makes a lot of sense because, you know, if an accident happened, if one of them got pregnant, well, so what? If that's normal in a marriage for somebody to get pregnant, nobody needs to know that it's the illegitimate son of the future king.
As King George's illness gets worse, so do his fears for his playboy son and the future of the British throne. He writes to the Prime Minister of England and shares a deeply personal wish that the crown skips Edward and instead goes to his second son, Bertie.
After I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and that nothing will come between Bertie and the throne.
He was frightened that his son would take up all of his hard work and throw it away.
But King George is powerless to change the line of succession. After he dies, Edward, his oldest son, will become King of Britain. And his son will have to face a new threat to Britain's peace. This time from abroad, Adolf Hitler. Since losing World War I, Germany has abolished its monarchy, which saw George V's royal cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, thrown out of the country. And now Adolf Hitler, the leader of the far-right Nazi party, has taken control. Hitler's leadership style is inspired by none other than Italy's Benito Mussolini.
Adolf Hitler very much used Mussolini's fascism in Italy as a template for what he wanted to do in Germany.
Hitler tries to emulate the ways in which Mussolini speaks as a big, declamatory style, Italiani. And so Hitler, 10 years later, would also begin speeches decrying German folk, and so on and so forth. He even copied Mussolini's style in a physical sense.
Mussolini soon becomes one of Hitler's closest allies, and they both build up armed forces and put on great military shows.
One will visit the other, and there'll be a great display of their armed forces. You know, this is how powerful we are. Anyone looking from the outside and seeing these great displays of military strength must have imagined that trouble was ahead.
Like Mussolini, Hitler also has ambitions to create a new empire through territorial expansion. He is determined to make up for Germany's humiliating defeat in World War I. Over in Britain, King George V is deeply worried. He hasn't forgotten the horrors of World War I. And now, another global war is on the horizon that could threaten his crown.
George V undoubtedly was concerned about this type of display of military strength by the fascist powers because he realized that ultimately, if they were going to get what they wanted, either you were going to give in to them or you were going to take them on. And if you were going to take them on, that was going to lead to war.
Hitler begins building up one of the most powerful armies the world has ever seen. And by 1936, with the collapse of the Democratic Republic in Spain, fascism is starting to spread here too. A fascist leader called General Franco takes control of part of the country. While Britain braces itself for war, disaster strikes at home. King George V, who has led Britain through the last war, dies. His oldest son inherits the throne and becomes King Edward VIII. But while his father rejected fascism, what does Edward think?
Everybody was looking at him thinking, what's he going to do next? Where could this go?
At his father's funeral, Edward faces his first test of character. He becomes the target of a fascist plot that could destabilize the British throne. His German cousin, the Duke of Coburg, has been sent on a secret mission to try and turn Edward into a supporter of Hitler. The Duke is a devout Nazi and even turns up to King George's funeral in a Nazi uniform.
He was a believer and a close friend of Hitler, and he had been trying many times to get close to Edward.
Because if the rumours are true, Edward is more open to siding with Germany than his father was.
He'd gone on many tours to Germany when he was a young man, so he had friends, he had relations, he had families. He could speak German fluently.
It said, I see no reason for there to be any difficulty between our two countries. We know of a bad feeling about the First World War is now over, and hopefully we can get on and have peace.
Edward doesn't see the danger in fascism and feels that Hitler is actually doing a good job.
He believed that Hitler was a vigorous reformer, and what he believed was that somebody like Hitler was needed for Britain.
Edward and the Duke of Coburg strike up a friendship, and he invites the new king to visit Hitler in Nazi Germany.
He was interceding, trying to use both his genuine belief in Hitler and his understanding that Edward, if not actually a Nazi, certainly a believer in German friendship and a believer in fascism.
He wasn't just making idle chit-chat, he was actually trying to have, potentially, the first Nazi king there'd ever been or ever could be.
Unlike his father, Edward is easily influenced and susceptible to flattery. Could Edward really be turned into a Nazi king? After Edward becomes King of Britain, another big question swirls around him. Who will he make his queen? Without a wife or an heir to the throne, the line of succession is under threat. Everyone wants to know, who will he make his princess bride? At a royal ceremony proclaiming his accession to the throne, Edward stuns the world when he watches it from a window with a mysterious woman by his side.
A photographer manages to catch a picture, an image of a shadowy woman by his side, and of course this woman is quickly identified.
Her name is Wallis Simpson. But at first she is kept a secret.
This was thought to be so scandalous. The leading newspaper publisher of the day made sure that it was kept out of every single newspaper, although it was commonly known in America and in Europe that the king had his special friend. It wasn't actually known in Britain at all.
So, who is Wallis Simpson? She's born on the other side of the world, near the East Coast American city of Baltimore.
Her father died when she was very young, and her mother tried to bring her up as a very feisty, independent woman.
She was somebody who was ambitious for money, she was ambitious for jewels, and I think you could argue that she was ambitious for love as well.
Although Wallis's first marriage ends in divorce, she moves to London with her second husband, Ernest Simpson. The ambitious couple quickly become a part of the royal social scene.
Half of her wanted security, half of her wanted to reach for the stars, and she recognised that in herself.
But then Wallis meets the then king-in-waiting, and Edward soon falls head over heels for Wallis and finds her lack of deference a big turn-on.
she doesn't respect monarchy very much, and she doesn't respect him for being a monarch, and he finds this dazzling. His entire life has been about, inheriting the throne, and here's a woman who doesn't see him for that and sees him for him and wants him romantically.
Now Edward is king. He wants to marry Wallis and make her Queen of England. But there's a big problem.
She's still married to Ernest Simpson, who seems aware of this relationship as well, because they're not hiding it, they're flaunting it.
For Edward to marry Wallis, Wallis would need to get a divorce for the second time in her life. But the Church of England is strictly against divorce, and as the new head of state, this also makes Edward head of the Church of England.
And if you have the head of the state who obviously does not respect Christian values, does not respect marriage, which is between God and a man and a woman, if he doesn't respect vows in church, why should he respect the vows he makes as king?
His late father's worst fears are coming true. The British people are split about what they think their king should do. But it is Edward that must choose the woman he loves or his duty to the crown. A nation awaits. Windsor Castle. Edward positions himself in front of a microphone. Millions tune in to listen as Edward lets his people know his decision.
You must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward is the first king in British history to voluntarily give up the throne, and he throws the monarchy into crisis.
And Edward's choosing to do that meant that most of his public, I mean not everyone, but most of the country essentially saw him and they thought he could have been such a brilliant king. So we have to consider the idea that the monarchy was at this very, very precarious stage.
This royal crisis couldn't have come at a worse time for Britain. Hitler and Mussolini are threatening war in Europe. Britain needs a strong ruler to steer its people through the storm ahead. And it gets Edward's younger brother, Prince Bertie. Prince Bertie is 18 months younger than Edward, but unlike his brother, is already happily married to British aristocrat Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, with 2 daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. But although the younger brother has a greater sense of duty, he doesn't have the same natural charisma as Edward, and is chronically shy.
He's a classic second son, plays second fiddle his whole childhood.
He's not as good looking, he's not as flamboyant.
Bertie was born with knocked knees, and while a child, his father made him wear a painful leg brace to correct the abnormality.
And he has a stammer, which is made much worse by the fact that every time he stammers in front of his father says, what? Get it out! Spit it out!
But Bertie has hidden qualities that could help endear him to the British public.
Bertie's strength is that he is ordinary and dutiful, and so he represents really much more the ordinary man.
Bertie's ordinariness could make him a safe choice of monarch.
Well, who do you want to inherit the throne? You're living at a time where there is a lot of social upheaval. To keep the monarchy, you need to make sure that the king doesn't do anything strange, doesn't do anything to risk this institution.
After Edward gives his abdication speech, the crown is passed on to Bertie, who shows respect to his late father when he becomes known as King George VI. The British people have a new king on the throne. the third king that year. As the first act of his reign, the new monarch gives his brother a new royal title.
It had to be decided what you would call the ex-king. Couldn't be just a prince, he couldn't be an ex-king. They needed to come up with a title for him.
Edward becomes His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. A duke is the highest-ranking title in the British nobility. A new king, a new duke. But is it the new beginning the British royal family needs? Britain has just survived its biggest royal upset in generations. King George's own family is secure. His wife and 2 daughters mean the future succession is guaranteed. But tensions between King George and his brother Edward soon boil over. In June 1937, Edward and Wallis marry, not in Britain, but in France, at the home of one of their millionaire friends. And none of the British royal family attend.
Suddenly, they had become non-people. And when their closest friends had asked if they could come to the wedding and be part of it, the King and Queen made it very clear that if they went to the wedding, they would be cut off.
As Edward's wife, the marriage makes Wallis the Duchess of Windsor. But his brother King George VI refuses to give Wallis the royal title of Her Royal Highness, or HRH.
The HRH title confers royalty, means you're royal. Subjects of the crown, the male ones bow their head to you, the females curtsy, they treat you as a royal. And this meant that although Edward was a royal, Wallis wasn't.
Edward minded that Wallis wasn't given HRH probably more than anything else in his life. He saw it as an ongoing snub, he saw it as an insult from his country.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor turn their backs on Britain and start a new life in France. King George VI now fears what his brother might do next to damage the royal family's reputation and put the British crown in jeopardy. Just 10 months after George has become king, his brother Edward decides to go on a trip with Wallis. An unsanctioned trip to Nazi Germany. Edward's Nazi uncle, the Duke of Coburg, hosts the two and arranges a high-profile meeting between the newlyweds and Hitler. They are treated like royalty.
Edward wanted his wife to be treated with all the respect and courtesy of a member of the royal family. And the one people who were willing to do that were, of course, the Nazis.
Hitler is charmed by Wallis and tells his interpreter that the Duchess would have made a good queen.
Photographs of Edward shaking his hand, of all of them being photographed of Wallis standing next to him. That was the best possible propaganda that Hitler could have had.
When King George learns about his brother's trip to meet Hitler, he's mortified. He calls it a bombshell, and a bad one too. Relations between Britain and Germany are already on a knife edge, and now his brother is befriending the enemy. But worse is yet to come. September 1939. World War II finally kicks off after Hitler invades Poland. Britain comes to the help of their Polish ally and declares war on Germany. Britain and France attempt to stop Hitler's advance across Europe, but they're no match for the German army.
I mean, the early stages of the Second World War are one of an unbroken run of successes for Germany.
And in less than 8 months, Hitler's army has control of most of Central Europe. In May 1940, at the instruction of senior politicians, King George appoints Winston Churchill as Prime Minister to lead Britain's fight against Hitler. But after a humiliating defeat in France, British troops are forced to evacuate from the beaches of Dunkirk. Nazi Germany now occupies most of France, and this is a huge concern for King George, because his brother, Edward, lives in the French capital, Paris. Is the former British king about to be captured by the Nazis? The British royal family expect Edward to support his fellow countrymen and return to England immediately.
So it would have made perfect sense for Edward to have gone back to England and to have found some sort of accord with his family. But Edward being Edward, he never did the sensible or the decent thing.
Instead of supporting the British troops and his British family, Edward goes to the south of France before heading to fascist Spain. George sees his brother's disloyalty as the ultimate betrayal. Churchill is furious.
It's always been termed a betrayal because he didn't do his duty.
For King George, this has now gone beyond a family feud. Edward is now seen as a threat to not just the survival of the British crown, but to the very fabric of the nation. By June 1940, the Nazis have control of mainland Europe and are now thinking of their next step, how to conquer Britain. Churchill marshals Britain's defences, but they have a critical weakness. The former King Edward has left France, and he's now in fascist Spain.
Fleeing to Spain at the time that England seems to need people and need people to be there, if only for purely symbolic reasons, it was either an act of cowardly pragmatism or simply of cowardice, depending on which way you look at it.
The Nazis now see an astonishing opportunity to win the former King of England over to Hitler's side. And if he won't come willingly, they have plans to kidnap him. Hitler launches an operation, codenamed Willy.
Well, Operation Willy has always been slightly shrouded in mystery. What he intended to do was to launch an operation whereby Edward and Wallace would be taken from Spain and brought to Germany.
The Nazis want to use Edward to bargain a peace settlement with Britain, and if they succeed, they'll dethrone his brother King George and restore Edward to the British throne.
And to use the king as a kind of puppet and to present him as the true ruler of Britain.
But what they hoped was that Edward could be persuaded not to have to be kidnapped, that he could come willingly.
Hitler might have plans for Edward and Wallace, but so too do Prime Minister Churchill and King George. They want Edward out of the picture. So Winston Churchill sends Edward a telegram instructing him to take a new job as governor of the Bahama Islands. The British-owned islands are over 4,000 miles away from Britain and, crucially, Nazi Germany. The question is, will Edward go?
Initially, Edward and Wallace were very distrustful of the choice to send him off to the Bahamas.
While Edward delays his departure, Hitler sends in one of his most effective undercover agents, Walter Schellenberg.
He was somebody who was a kind of a Nazi James Bond, I suppose, is the easiest way of describing him. He was this Nazi secret agent who was very suave.
Schellenberg attempts to scare the couple into staying in Europe by feeding Edward's worst fears that the British are out to get him, and the appointment in the Bahamas is a death trap.
The key to Operation Willy was to play on the suspicions and indeed paranoia that the Windsors had about British intelligence wanting to assassinate them. At one point, Walter Schellenberg actually paid people to throw stones at the windows of the house that the Windsors were staying in.
But Schellenberg's mind games fail. The Windsors depart for their position in the Bahamas and set sail from Europe. and King George VI can breathe easy. His brother is out of Hitler's reach. For now. As Edward suns himself in the Bahamas, King George and Britain now face the full force of Hitler's war machine. His Luftwaffe Air Force launched daily attacks on cities all over Britain. For 57 days, London is bombed from the air. King George and his wife Queen Elizabeth work hard to show the British royal family are not blind to the country's suffering.
Bertie was a very, very shy private man, and he was suddenly thrust into the limelight, the biggest limelight there was, during a time where Britain was in crisis.
George VI makes public visits to bomb sites and refuses to leave London, even when Buckingham Palace becomes a bombing target.
This was a hugely important part of Bertie as a man. As King George VI, he represented his people. He was brave with his people. He stayed in London and he appeared in front of them.
Although the King's advisors recommend Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret evacuate to America, the family decide to stay, to form a united front. When Princess Elizabeth turns 18, she gets behind the war effort, training as a truck driver and mechanic. The whole family work hard to boost morale and get the country through its darkest hours.
I mean, it was really bad. The rationing was abhorrent. People were dying every night in bombing raids. You had, the King and Queen going from place to place, encouraging everyday people to work their hardest, to appreciate them, knowing how important that was to them.
But while George's family keeps up morale on the home front, his brother continues to cause trouble for the royals. Now the Windsors are in the Bahamas, they're quick to integrate themselves within a tight-knit circle of millionaires and Nazi sympathizers. Edward continues to cause trouble for Britain when he gives a pro-Hitler interview to the American press in December 1940.
He'd make quite unguarded comments in which he'd say that he felt that England should have sought terms with Germany, or that his brother was somebody who wasn't the best king he could have been.
He also had a complete lack of belief in Britain's victory in the Second World War, and so as a result, he did say some extremely stupid and embarrassing things.
The United States are officially neutral at this stage, but the interview causes so much attention that the couple come under the surveillance of the FBI.
Well, the main reason why the Windsors were under surveillance by US intelligence was the fear that they were actually Nazis. What had happened with Operation Willy, with Edward's visit to Germany, with the constant belief that he had these Nazi sympathies, was that it was not known what he was going to do.
But not long after Edward's interview, America enters the war on the side of the British. And the tides of war begin to turn against Germany and their fascist ally, Italy. In July 1943, Allied troops begin to take back mainland Europe. They start by landing on the Italian island of Sicily, and then work their way up through Italy's mainland peninsula. Mussolini's army fails to stop them.
So even though Mussolini claimed to have prepared Italy for war and for nationalist triumph, by 1943, Italy is falling apart.
Mussolini's armies are really on the verge of collapse. They've been defeated in North Africa, they've been defeated in Russia. It's the beginning of the end.
The Italian army has already suffered huge losses in the war, and public opinion is turning against Mussolini. Victor Emmanuel realizes that to survive on the Italian throne, he must get rid of Mussolini. The king attempts to distance himself from fascism and has Mussolini arrested. After the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime, Italy soon turns its back on Hitler and swaps to the Allies' side. When the war finally draws to a close 2 years later, Mussolini falls into the hands of the angry Italian mob.
Mussolini's end is particularly grisly, and you could say, in some ways, a deserved fate for such a bombastic and aggressive dictator.
They're hung upside down from a burnt-out petrol station in Piazzale Loreto in northern Milan, for all of Milan to see.
Just 2 days after Mussolini's execution, Adolf Hitler accepts Germany has lost the war and commits suicide. With the two fascist leaders dead, World War II in Europe comes to a bloody end. People across Europe celebrate the end of the fighting and now look to an uncertain future. Victor Emmanuel of Italy has tried to distance himself from Mussolini, but the people of Italy won't easily forget.
Victor Emmanuel has attempted to save his throne and the monarchy by disassociating himself with Mussolini and the fascists, but frankly it's too little too late.
Around 25 million Italians vote on whether to keep their royal family or become a republic.
Italy becomes a republic, and so Vittorio Emanuele and the House of Savoy become normal citizens.
Emmanuel loses his crown and goes into exile in Egypt, where he dies a few years later. But he's not alone. The monarchs of countries like Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Romania also lose their thrones during the aftermath of World War II. But King George VI survives and celebrates the victory from the Buckingham Palace balcony.
George VI is rightly regarded as one of Britain's greatest rulers.
George resisted the allure of fascism and avoided the mistakes of the Italian royal family.
I think he's not regarded so much as a great ruler because he was comfortable being king, but because he was the right man at the right time. And I think that we were very lucky as a country that we lost an awful king and gained a great one.
But George is not out of the woods just yet. If his brother Edward's link to Hitler is discovered by the public, it could be the death of the British monarchy. How far will the royal family go to keep their fascist secrets hidden? In this post-war world, where fascists face trial and execution, fascism is the dirtiest of words. For any royal family to survive, they must go to extremes to get their people to forget their wartime pasts. They must adapt to a new world order, dominated by a different kind of war. A war not of attacks and invasions, but a war of propaganda and espionage. A war between East and West, between the USA and the USSR, the Cold War.